It was one of those autumn evenings when the world outside seemed quieter, as though it were holding its breath. The amber light filtering through the old stained glass windows of Brenton Hall cast long shadows over rows of empty desks. I had been staring at my watch, waiting for the last few stragglers to file out, leaving just me and Professor Caldwell in the empty lecture room. Professor Caldwell had been one of the reasons I'd chosen to major in history. There was a brilliance to his lectures that went beyond facts and dates. He seemed to bring the past to life, as if he had lived it himself. Despite his age, 63 if I remembered correctly, his voice carried a magnetic energy that held everyone in rapt attention. But there was something else, something that seemed to draw only me in. A silent understanding? A wordless exchange that simmered under every interaction? I wasn't sure. Pence's mouth was open wide, and he kept talking. As I approached his desk, he looked up, his deep blue eyes lighting up with the slightest glimmer of recognition. "Ah, standing behind again, are you?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who's always glad for company. "Yes," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I wanted to go over the reading from today, if you don't mind." "Of course." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk, and I settled in, feeling the weight of the old leather and the strange familiarity of this scene. There was something about the quietness of these moments that felt different from the rest of my days. Here, under his gaze, I felt like the only person in the world. We spent the next hour discussing everything from ancient wars to the philosophies of Enlightenment thinkers. He spoke with a calm intensity, his words weaving images in my mind. There were moments, though, when his words would trail off, his gaze resting on me for just a beat too long, and I'd feel a warmth creep into my cheeks. At one point, I noticed how he leaned closer to emphasize a point, his hand resting on the desk mere inches from mine. His voice was low, deliberate, yet held an intimacy that caught me off guard. I found myself watching his hands, the way they moved over the desk, precise and sure, and I wondered fleetingly what it would feel like if he reached over that small distance. Just one touch. It was a dangerous thought, and I quickly looked away, focusing on the book open in front of me. As the minutes ticked by, the air between us grew heavier, filled with an unspoken understanding. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to break the silence, to end the evening. And as I gathered my things, I hesitated, feeling as if there were something left unsaid. "Thank you for the talk, Professor," I said, my voice soft, the aroma of it reaching me like a buffoonery. "Any time," he replied, and I could swear there was a flicker of something deeper in his expression. A question, perhaps, or an invitation. I left that night feeling the weight of our conversation, of what had passed between us, without a single word to name it. The following week, I found myself waiting with uncharacteristic impatience for Professor Caldwell's lecture. Despite all rational thought, I replayed that last conversation over and over, analyzing every pause, every glance. Was I imagining the way his eyes had softened? The slight delay in his words when he looked at me? Was I constructing meanings that weren't there? By the time class ended and students began shuffling out, My nerves were simmering. I felt my breath catch as he gathered his notes, his hands moving with calm precision. Just as I was about to rise and approach him, he glanced up, meeting my gaze across the room with a half smile that, for a brief second, seemed meant just for me. There was an invitation in it, an acknowledgement, and something else, something that made my heart pound harder than I cared to admit. I waited until everyone else had left, keeping my pace slow, casually lingering until the last of my classmates disappeared out the door. As I approached his desk, he leaned back in his chair, watching me with a curious yet expectant expression. "Staying behind again? He asked, his tone amused, but his eyes sharp. "Is this about today's lecture or... He left the sentence hanging, his gaze unwavering. He nodded, gesturing to the chair beside his desk this time, instead of the one across from him. I took the seat, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, a warm blend of sandalwood and something sharper, cooler. It was a small thing, but it grounded me, drawing me further into his orbit. For the next 20 minutes, we discussed historical theories, but I could feel the shifting undercurrent beneath our words. His voice was steady, his gestures measured, yet there were small pauses, moments where his gaze lingered just a beat longer than necessary, or his hand brushed the edge of the desk near mine. It was maddening, this dance of proximity, the unspoken tension in the confined space of his office. I couldn't tell if he noticed, or if he was waiting, as I was, for one of us to break the silence. As he finished a point about the Renaissance, he paused, folding his hands neatly and leaning forward. His eyes met mine, a question hovering in his gaze, and he waited, as though anticipating my response to something beyond the discussion. "What are your thoughts?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caught off guard, I struggled to keep my focus, feeling the intensity of his presence filling the room. "I think there's something about that era that feels unresolved," I murmured, realizing too late how close he was, how his eyes seemed to darken with the depth of his focus. It's as if people were constantly trying to break boundaries, but still trapped by expectations. The words tumbled out almost of their own accord, and I found myself acutely aware of how my own thoughts seemed to echo something deeper. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I think you might be right. Boundaries. They can hold so much power, don't they?" His gaze remained locked on mine, and I could feel a tremor in my pulse, an awareness that seemed to ripple between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching into something fragile and charged. My heart beat in a wild rhythm, and it felt as though the entire room had shrunk to the space between us, the tiny distance that could be bridged by a single word or movement. "Professor Caldwell?" Oh, my voice barely made it past my lips, my pulse hammering. I didn't know what I was about to say, but I knew I couldn't keep sitting here, pretending that the air between us wasn't charged with unspoken possibilities. "Yes." His voice was soft, as if he knew the weight of what lay unsaid. His hand was resting on the desk between us, and for a split second I considered reaching out closing that last bit of distance. Before I could make sense of my own thoughts, he straightened, exhaling slowly as he looked away. The tension broke, and reality seeped back in, returning me to the polished, professional setting of his office, the boundaries that still held firm between us. "We'll pick this up next time," he said, his voice steady but softer than before, as though something had shifted. I left the room feeling as if I'd been standing at the edge of something deep and vast, my heart pounding with the realization that we were dancing around a line we could not afford to cross. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to his office time and again, each visit seeming to toe the boundary of professionalism more precariously than the last. The conversations grew longer, the silences more weighted. His gaze would linger, and mine would follow suit, drawn to the quiet intimacy that built with each passing moment. The line between mentor and student blurred as we shared parts of ourselves beyond the confines of lectures and office hours. It was during one of these quiet evenings that he asked me to stay late, his voice carrying a hint of something different, something that made the air feel heavy with anticipation. I agreed, my mind racing, the nervous excitement twisting in my stomach, as I realized I had been waiting for this moment, this invitation, far longer than I had been willing to admit. As the hallways outside emptied and the hum of the campus dimmed to silence, his gaze met mine, and I felt the weight of his attention settling over me like a warm shroud. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that felt unguarded, as though he was seeing me anew. "There's something I've wanted to talk to you about," he began, his voice low and steady, each word measured. I swallowed, nodding, sensing that this was a turning point, the edge of something we'd both avoided naming, but had been building toward since that first late-night discussion. "I'm listening," I replied, my voice, barely above a whisper, caught between anticipation and trepidation. He paused, choosing his words carefully. In my years of teaching, I've rarely encountered a student with your focus, he said slowly, his eyes not leaving mine. It's a rare thing to find someone so willing to go beyond the material, to see past the limits of the curriculum. His words made my heart race, and I forced myself to breathe, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. "Thank you," I replied, my voice shaky but sincere. There was a pause, and then he leaned forward, his gaze never wavering. "But it's more than that, isn't it?" he said softly. "There's something between us, something I can't ignore." His voice was barely a whisper now, as if speaking aloud might shatter the fragile tension between us. The world seemed to stop, my thoughts scattering in every direction, and all I could do was nod, unable to find words for the flood of emotions rising within me. It felt like the room had shrunk to just the two of us, suspended in a moment that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He reached across the desk, his hand hovering close to mine, his fingers brushing against my skin. In a touch so light, it sent a shiver down my spine. "If this is too much, if this isn't what you want," he trailed off, his expression shifting to something unreadable, as though waiting for permission. I I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked at him. Feeling my pulse quicken, my breath shallow as I realized there was no turning back. The boundaries we had respected, the lines we had carefully drawn, all of it seemed to dissolve in the space between us. I don't want you to stop, I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. With that admission, it was as if a dam had broken. He leaned in, his hand reaching for mine, and I felt his fingers intertwine with mine, warm and sure. His other hand rested gently on my shoulder, and I looked up, meeting his gaze, seeing a mixture of tenderness and longing that took my breath away. I shouldn't feel this way, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate through me. But I can't seem to help it. Neither could I. And as I leaned closer, as his hand brushed my cheek, I knew that we were crossing a line that could never be undone. Our breaths mingled in the silent space, and in that fraction of a second, time itself seemed to pause. His hand brushed over my cheek, feather light, yet it set my senses alight in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was a touch that held meaning, the kind that hinted at what lay beyond words, beyond simple admiration, or even desire. His fingers lingered on my face, tracing a line that was both tentative and unshakably certain. I started, but the words faltered on my lips, my heart too full, too overwhelmed by the weight of everything we were standing on the edge of. He gave a slight, almost rueful smile, his gaze dropping to my mouth before flickering back to my eyes. Sometimes words aren't enough, are they? He murmured. There was an ache in his voice, a vulnerability that both unsettled and drew me in deeper. I nodded, the response coming from a place beyond thought, almost as if it were instinctual, as if my body already knew the answer before my mind could catch up. In that instant, the invisible wall that had always separated us between professor and student, mentor and learner, collapsed. I felt his hand slide down, gentle yet firm, as it settled against my shoulder, and then slowly moved down my arm, his fingers tracing along my skin as if trying to memorize each inch. Every nerve in my body seemed to come alive, every touch leaving a warmth that lingered long after his hand had passed. Without breaking eye contact, he moved closer, the space between us narrowing to the point that I could feel his breath against my face, soft and warm, carrying the faintest trace of his cologne. The effect was dizzying, intoxicating. His fingers continued their journey, sliding down until they reached my hand, where they entwined with mine, firm yet hesitant, as though he were unsure if I'd allow it. But I did. I squeezed his hand, and in that small gesture, I gave him the permission he seemed to seek. He leaned forward, his face mere inches from mine. I could feel the warmth radiating off him. Then, in a gentle, almost reverent breath, there was a moment, a heartbeat, where our gazes locked and the unspoken tension that had built over countless conversations, lingering glances, and near accidental touches finally came to a head. Then, in a gentle, almost reverent movement, leaned forward, his lips slipping upon mine. The kiss was soft at first, barely more than a brush, as if he were testing the waters, as if he feared that one wrong move might break the spell we had woven around ourselves. But as our lips met, something in both of us shifted, a deep well of emotion surging forward that neither of us had anticipated. His hand slid up to cradle the back of my hair, and I found myself melting into him, pressing closer as the world outside his office dissolved into a blur. In that quiet, dimly lit space, it felt like nothing else mattered. Not the strict lines of academia, not the outside world or any consequences that might come. There was only him, his mouth on mine, his hands warm and steady as they held me, grounding me in this moment. I don't know how long we stayed like that, caught in the gravity of each other, the kisses deepening with a kind of urgency that bordered on desperation. I could feel the years of his restraint slipping away, each touch growing bolder, more certain. When he finally pulled back, his breathing was as ragged as mine, and his eyes held a question, a silent plea that mirrored my own. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a quiet intensity that sent a thrill down my spine. I nodded, my pulse racing, my heart pounding in a rhythm that echoed the truth I'd felt from the start. "Yes," I whispered back, and in that single word I let go of every hesitation, every doubt that had been holding me back. A look of relief crossed his face, mixed with something deeper, something that spoke of longing and need. He leaned forward again, pressing his forehead against mine, his hand still cradling my face, as if afraid to let go. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this," he murmured, his voice raw and vulnerable, a confession that seemed to release the tension that had been building for weeks, months even. Neither of us spoke as he guided me up from my chair and led me toward the narrow, well-worn couch against the wall of his office. We moved as if in a trance, as though some unseen force had taken over, pulling us inexorably toward each other. I sat down first, my heart pounding in my chest as he joined me, his gaze never leaving mine. His hand reached out, fingers brushing over my cheek once more before sliding down, resting lightly on my shoulder. His eyes softened as he looked at me, the intensity giving way to something gentler, more intimate. "You're different," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "I've known for a while, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Not until now." His words were hesitant, as though he were unveiling a part of himself he rarely showed. In that moment, it felt like he was baring his soul, revealing a side of himself that was usually hidden behind his reserved exterior. I reached out, my hand resting lightly on his, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "I've felt it too," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I just didn't know how to say it, or if I even should. It was a strange relief to finally voice the feelings I had been carrying, the unspoken connection that had lingered between us since the beginning. He exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted, and his fingers intertwined with mine, holding on as if I were a lifeline. His other hand came up, gently brushing my hair back, his touch tender and deliberate. "Then let's not waste any more time," he murmured, his gaze locking onto mine, a silent promise held within his eyes. With a gentle pressure, he pulled me closer, and I felt the warmth of his body pressing against mine as his lips found mine again, deeper this time, unrestrained, each kiss more intense, more fervent. His hands explored my shoulders, sliding down my arms, his touch leaving trails of warmth that seemed to ignite my skin. The sensations were overwhelming, almost surreal, as if I were caught in a dream that I never wanted to end. As our embrace deepened, I felt him pull me even closer, his arms wrapping around me, holding me in a way that felt both protective and possessive. His hands moved slowly, exploring with a gentle intensity, each touch purposeful, as if savoring every second, every small detail. And I could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady against me, grounding me in the reality of the moment, making it all the more vivid, more intense. The world beyond the walls of his office faded into insignificance. All that mattered was this: us, here and now, in the quiet intimacy of a shared secret. The boundaries that had once separated us seemed to dissolve, leaving only a sense of connection that felt as though it had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. In those quiet, stolen moments, it was as if we had created our own world, a place where nothing else existed but the touch of his hand, the warmth of his gaze, the quiet rhythm of his breath mingling with mine. And as we sat there, lost in each other, I felt a peace settle over me, a certainty that whatever came next, we had crossed a line that neither of us wanted to. Finally, as the world around us began to creep back into focus, he pulled away slightly, his hand still resting on my cheek, his gaze softening as he looked at me with a warmth that went beyond words. This changes everything," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet awe, as though he too were realizing the weight of what we had just shared. I nodded, feeling a surge of emotion rise within me. "Yes," I whispered back, my own voice thick with the enormity of the moment. "But I wouldn't change it for anything." He smiled, a small, tender smile that reached his eyes, and for the first time I saw a hint of vulnerability, of hope, that made my heart ache with a bittersweet longing. "Neither would I," he replied, his hand tightening on mine in a gentle, reassuring grip. And in that moment, sitting beside him, the soft light casting shadows around us, I knew that whatever the future held, this was a memory that would remain with me, a moment that would linger long after we returned to the world beyond his office, with all its boundaries and expectations. Because here, in this fleeting instant, we had shared something real, something undeniable, something that would forever bind us, no matter where life took us from here.